The morning air hung thick with mist as Martha Clemens crossed the field toward the Harper property, the hem of her dress soaked in dew. She clutched a basket of eggs and freshly baked bread, as she did every Thursday since the war began. Nathaniel Harper had returned from France half a man, and his wife Agnes rarely ventured into town. But it wasn't the eggs or bread that made Martha stop dead in her tracks. It was the sound, low rhythmic and not quite human, drifting from the barn. Curiosity overtook fear. She dropped the basket and approached slowly, her boots crunching frostbitten grass. The barn door, usually bolted tight, creaked open just an inch. She peeked inside and screamed. Inside the barn, Lucy Harper sat cross-legged on the dirt floor, her eyes closed, her palms facing upward. Around her, in precise circles, lay the bodies of rabbits, birds, and a goat, their limbs arranged like offerings. But it was the sounds coming from Lucy's lips that shattered Martha's mind. Not screams, not cries, words. Latin, Hebrew, and something older, deeper, like the groan of the earth itself. Words no 8-year-old should know, words no human should utter with such calm certainty. Et lux in tenebris lucet, she intoned. Et tenebrae eam non comprehenderunt. By the time Nathaniel came running, shotgun in hand, Martha had fainted on the threshold. He gathered his daughter, expression unreadable, and carried her silently into the house. Behind him, the circle of dead animals remained untouched, eerily pristine. Just 2 weeks earlier, Lucy Harper had buried her younger brother, Thomas. He was 5. Pneumonia, the doctor said, or maybe the fever that had taken so many. The coffin was small and white, lowered into the cold ground behind the chapel by trembling hands. Lucy hadn't cried. Not once. She had stood there in silence, her pale face unreadable, her hands clasped before her, as though in prayer. That night, she spoke her first strange sentence. Agnes heard it through the walls, a murmur in the dark. She rushed into Lucy's room expecting tears, but found her daughter sitting upright in bed, eyes wide open, whispering to something unseen. Shanulu en lil kima. Agnes froze. Her knees weakened. She recognized not a single word, yet they rang with the weight of ancient command. Lucy's eyes turned to her, then back to the ceiling. They want me to tell you, she said in perfect English, but I don't know how. The next morning, Nathaniel nailed shut the windows of Lucy's room and stuffed the keyhole with cloth. He pulled Agnes aside and whispered something about temptation, about protecting their child from evil. Agnes said nothing, but she noticed the trembling in his hands. Lucy stopped eating meat. She refused to wear shoes. She began spending hours in silence, staring at the wind chimes outside, her head tilted as if listening to music no one else could hear. She was 8 years old. News traveled fast through the village of Bell's Hollow, especially in times like these. The Spanish flu had claimed 6 lives that autumn alone. Folks were jumpy, anxious for signs, omens. And this was more than gossip. She speaks in tongues, they whispered. A gift from the Lord, said some. A curse, said others. By the 3rd day, Reverend Jonathan Shaw had heard enough. He stood at the pulpit of St. Mercy's Church and delivered a sermon that shook the pews. There are words no man should speak, he declared. There are tongues of angels and tongues of devils. Beware the counterfeit. The congregation shifted uncomfortably. Everyone knew who he meant. That night, 3 boys dared each other to spy on the Harper barn. They returned before midnight, pale and breathless. They said Lucy had no eyes, only light pouring from her face. They said the animals walked in circles around her. No one could prove a word, but no one questioned it either. 4 days after Martha's discovery, the doctor from Boston arrived. A tall man with a limp and thick wire glasses, he introduced himself as Dr. Wallace Muir. He brought no nurse, no assistant, just a suitcase full of instruments and a notebook thicker than a Bible. He spent 2 hours with Lucy alone in the parlor while her parents waited on the porch. When he emerged, his face was blank. She's not catatonic, he said. She's not delusional. He hesitated. She asked me if I still dream of the ocean. I do. Every night. Nathaniel stared. Agnes swallowed hard. She also told me, Muir continued, that my mother's maiden name was Eidelman. I've never told a soul that. She spoke it in perfect German. No one said a word. If you're drawn to mysterious tales like this one, make sure to subscribe to our channel so you never miss the next haunting mystery. Something tells us Lucy Harper's story is far from over. Bell's Hollow had always been a place of long memories and whispered warnings. Built on soil older than its stone church and wooden houses, the village remembered things even its oldest residents had forgotten. It watched, it judged, and now it watched Lucy Harper. After Martha Clemens' collapse, people no longer came to the Harper farm. Not for trade, not for visits, not even to gossip. The Harpers were left to themselves, and that was how most preferred it. But silence bred suspicion, and stories began to curl through the town like smoke from unseen fire. "She's not the same child," murmured old Mr. Harlan at the mill. "Talks to shadows, they say," replied his apprentice, eyes wide. By week's end, tales spread of Lucy standing alone in the forest, murmuring to the trees. A trapper named Elias claimed he'd seen her holding her arms out, as birds perched calmly on her shoulders. "Didn't blink once," he said, taking a long sip of ale. "Didn't move when I called her name. Just smiled like she knew something I didn't." In a place like Bell's Hollow, that was more than enough to stoke fear. Nathaniel Harper responded the only way he knew how, with prayer and severity. He chained the barn doors, salted the thresholds, and recited scripture until his voice cracked. He denied Lucy access to the woods and forbade her from speaking to anyone outside the home. He brought her meals to her room and nailed shut the cellar. But Lucy didn't resist. She rarely spoke anymore. She didn't cry. She simply watched him with an expression far too calm for a child her age, as though she were waiting for something he could not stop. Agnes, meanwhile, felt the pressure mounting like water behind a dam. Her neighbors no longer made eye contact. Children who used to play near their fence now crossed the road to avoid it. The bakery had run out of flour twice that week when she came by. Then came the letter. Slipped under the door one grey morning, it was unsigned. The ink was heavy and deliberate. "She is not your child anymore. Let the church decide her fate." Agnes burned it in the hearth without telling Nathaniel, but the words clung to her bones. When the villagers began whispering about Lucy's forest walks, Reverend Shaw took it upon himself to observe. He followed her one morning, hidden among the trees, as she wandered barefoot through the frozen moss. She did not look back, did not speak, did not cry from the cold. Instead, she placed her hand on the bark of an ancient elm and whispered something too faint to hear. Then slowly, as if moved by wind from within, the leaves trembled, though no breeze stirred the air. The Reverend returned shaken, but said nothing. The following Sunday, his sermon thundered with a warning. "We are not simply flesh, we are vessels," he bellowed. "And when we leave ourselves empty, when grief hollows us out, we make room for things that were never meant to return." The congregation sat in rigid silence. Even those who once defended Lucy now shifted uncomfortably. That afternoon, a committee gathered in the back room of the general store. 5 men and 2 women, all respected townsfolk. They spoke in hushed tones of protection, tradition, and purification. By dusk, they had agreed to approach the matter formally if the Harpers would not. Meanwhile, Agnes found herself plagued by dreams. Each night she woke gasping, her sheets damp. The image of a black cathedral burned into her mind. In her sleep, she heard her daughter's voice repeating strange syllables, sometimes comforting, sometimes commanding, and always, in the end, silence like a tomb sealing shut. One afternoon, she sat beside Lucy on the porch. The child was humming, not a lullaby, not a hymn, something that rose and fell in perfect meter like a chant. Agnes reached for her daughter's hand. "Do you know what they're saying about you?" Lucy tilted her head. "That I'm not yours anymore." Agnes froze. "Who told you that?" Lucy looked up, and for the briefest moment, her eyes seemed not empty, but full, like storm clouds about to burst. They did. The tension reached its peak the following week when Dr. Wallace Muir returned, this time with a phonograph and a cylinder recorder. He asked to speak with Lucy again. Nathaniel refused. Agnes insisted. For 1 hour, Lucy sat across from the doctor and answered simple questions: name, age, favorite food. Then he asked if she remembered the languages she'd spoken during their last meeting. She closed her eyes and repeated the same sentence in Latin, German, Sumerian, and an unidentified dialect that made Muir visibly pale. When he played the recording back, static crackled through the device. Then silence. The recording had captured nothing. Nathaniel slammed the door on Muir's retreating figure, but the next day, the doctor published a letter in the Boston Post, anonymized but clear. There exists a child in Bell's Hollow whose speech defies all known linguistic theory. If she is not studied, we risk losing access to something older than civilization itself. The village read the article in stunned silence. The line between curiosity and condemnation had blurred, and so the watching became waiting. Nathaniel Harper no longer prayed aloud. He whispered. His voice was hoarse from nights of repetition, muttering psalms beneath his breath like incantations. The walls of the house were covered in scripture now, pages torn from old Bibles, glued and nailed and pinned until every surface bore black ink. Lucy walked among them without blinking. "She won't eat," Agnes said one morning, her voice frayed. "Only drinks water, just sits and stares out the window." Nathaniel didn't respond. He was busy sealing the door to the attic with a thick strip of iron. "Salt and steel," he muttered. "They said it wards off what walks through words." Agnes didn't ask who they were. She hadn't seen her husband sleep in 3 days. That night, she found Lucy standing by the hearth, speaking softly, not in tongues, but in a voice that sounded foreign even when the words were English. "I don't dream anymore," Lucy said, staring at the cold ashes. "They do it for me now." Agnes took her hand. It was ice cold. 2 days later, a woman arrived in Bell's Hollow. She wore a deep green coat and carried a leather satchel embroidered with an unfamiliar symbol. Her name was Miriam Caldwell, and she claimed to be a folklorist from New York. She'd read Dr. Muir's letter in the Boston Post. She asked to see Lucy. Nathaniel refused her entry. Agnes didn't. They spoke in hushed tones in the kitchen, Miriam explaining she'd seen signs like Lucy's before. In Siberia, in Tunisia, in southern France, always after war, always after great death. Children who remember things they never learned. Some call it reincarnation, I don't. "What do you call it?" Agnes asked. "Leakage," Miriam said. "The past bleeding through the cracks." She showed Agnes a worn notebook. Inside were sketches, circles of animals, strange markings, words Agnes didn't recognize, but she recognized Lucy's handwriting. It was identical to what now filled the margins of her schoolbooks. "She needs help," Miriam said. "Not fear, not chains." That night, Agnes confronted Nathaniel. "She's still our daughter," she said. "No," he replied, eyes burning. "She's been hollowed out. What's inside her now is watching us." Agnes slapped him. In the attic, behind the iron-sealed door, Agnes discovered a journal wrapped in waxed linen. The pages were fragile, the ink faded, but the name scrawled on the first page was unmistakable. Margaret E. Harper, 1692, a great-grandmother. No one spoke of her. No one even remembered her full name. Agnes had found her once in an old family tree with the note, "Unfit for remembrance." The journal's contents were disturbing. "I dream of fire under the floor," one entry read, "of men with no eyes and women with broken jaws singing hymns in words that split my head." Another, "They chose me when I was 6. I heard them in the well." The final entry, "They are not gods, they are not devils. They are what comes before names." Agnes slammed the journal shut. Her breath caught in her chest. Lucy stood at the doorway. "I told you," she said. "They've been here before." One morning, Nathaniel attempted to baptize Lucy again, alone with a basin of water drawn from the well. As he pressed her head down, whispering in Latin, she stared up at him and began speaking fluently in return. Not in Latin, in something older, guttural, musical and wrong. Nathaniel screamed and dropped her. The basin shattered. Lucy didn't move, just lay on the floor, eyes open, lips moving in silence. That afternoon he fasted. That night He burned Lucy's clothes in the fireplace. "I will save her," he told Agnes. "You're too late," she whispered. The next morning the villagers gathered outside the Harpers' gate, not in protest, not in support, in silent curiosity. They stood in a loose half-circle, watching the house. Lucy sat on the porch steps, drawing in a small book. When Miriam Caldwell stepped into the crowd and called out Lucy's name, the girl lifted her head and smiled. "They're inside the bones of the house," she said. Miriam approached slowly, ignoring Nathaniel's shouted warnings. "What do they want?" she asked. Lucy's smile faded. To be remembered. Then she handed Miriam the notebook and stood. "I don't want to speak anymore," she said. That evening, Miriam showed Agnes the drawings. Spiral diagrams, symbols etched into figures resembling burial sites, notes in phonetic transcriptions that defied modern language. But one phrase repeated itself, dozens of times, in different dialects, in different orientations. "We were here before the flood. We will be here after the silence." Miriam circled one entry and read. "She's referencing something not found in any known religious or mythological source. This isn't imitation. It's transmission." Agnes couldn't breathe. "We need to protect her," Miriam said. But the word protect felt insufficient. Agnes wasn't sure what Lucy was becoming, but she knew it wasn't something Bell's Hollow could contain. It was the coldest night of the season when Lucy vanished from her bed. Agnes discovered the window open, frost coating the sill, her daughter's footprints leading into the woods. No coat, no boots, just small, bare imprints in the snow. Nathaniel grabbed his lantern and a rifle, refusing Agnes's plea to wait for help. He followed the trail past the edge of their land, through thorn and pine, until the footprints stopped in a perfect circle. There, in the center, stood Lucy, motionless, eyes open, lips still. She was muttering in the language again. The words rose in cadence, forming loops that began and ended in themselves. The sound echoed unnaturally, like it came from beneath the ground. Nathaniel approached, but Lucy lifted one hand without turning. "Don't step inside," she said. Nathaniel stopped. His breath clouded before him. The air around Lucy felt wrong, like it had thickened into something more than wind. "You'll wake them," she whispered, and collapsed into the snow. He carried her home in silence. She didn't wake for hours. When she did, she asked why he'd brought her back. The next day, Lucy drew a series of intricate symbols in the frost on the window pane. She worked slowly, repeating the same patterns over and over, concentric circles with barbs pointing inward, spiraled glyphs bisected by vertical lines. When the frost melted, she drew them in dirt, then on the walls with charcoal. Agnes documented the shapes in her sewing book, unsure why. Miriam Caldwell, still in town, insisted they weren't merely decorative. "These are structural," she said. "Not art, not play. She's constructing something." Dr. Calloway arrived later that week, summoned by telegram. A professor of ancient linguistics at Harvard, he had once corresponded with Dr. Muir. When shown Lucy's symbols, his interest turned from academic to personal. "These resemble Proto-Elamite inscriptions," he murmured, "but the structure's all wrong. It's evolving." Agnes allowed him to speak with Lucy under her supervision. At first, Lucy said nothing. She only listened as he listed languages. When he reached Akkadian, she sat up and asked for paper. She wrote a single sentence. Calloway's face turned pale. "This phrase doesn't exist," he said. "It shouldn't make sense, but I understand it." Lucy smiled. Word spread quickly that a Harvard professor had visited the Harpers. Curious villagers lingered by the property, pretending to pick berries or walk their dogs. Some whispered that Lucy had become a medium, others that she was simply mad. But few believed she was still just a child. Nathaniel refused to speak to Calloway. "You people think she's a puzzle," he said. "She's not. She's a door." But the professor remained, studying Lucy's writings and documenting her speech. He noted that she no longer simply repeated old languages. She seemed to generate them, as though recalling knowledge from a place that did not abide by human time. One evening, Agnes found him sitting outside, eyes wide, staring at the barn. "She said something tonight," he whispered. "Not just words, meaning. It was like she carved it into my mind." He handed her a page. On it, Lucy had written in looping script, "There are bones beneath your church. They still remember the hymns." Agnes stared at the page for a long time. She didn't ask what it meant. She already knew. Strange sounds began drifting through the house at night, faint metallic ringing like distant bells, always heard near the fireplace. Lucy spoke less during the day, conserving her voice as though preparing for something important. Her drawings now included crude maps, outlines of fields, trees, a deep pit marked with a sigil. When Agnes questioned her, Lucy only said, "That's where it began." Miriam studied the maps and froze. "These symbols," she said, "they're not random. They mark alignment points, like ritual geometry." "You're saying she's building a ritual?" Agnes asked, horrified. "I'm saying she's remembering one," Miriam replied. "One she didn't live." Nathaniel, pushed to breaking, confronted Lucy directly. "What are you?" he demanded. "What's inside you?" Lucy looked up from her drawings. "I'm not alone," she said. "You never were." He raised his hand, but something in her expression made him lower it. There was no defiance, only certainty. That night he dug up the old cellar floor, searching for anything buried, any cursed object. Instead he found bones, small, brittle, animal and human alike, arranged in patterns that matched Lucy's drawings exactly. He didn't tell Agnes. He simply sat at the kitchen table until dawn, whispering verses he no longer believed. Lucy began walking in her sleep again, but never left the house. She wandered the halls, hand trailing along the walls, eyes open, voice low. She repeated phrases in no known tongue. Sometimes Agnes wrote them down. Sometimes she pretended not to hear. Once Lucy paused at the front door, pressed her forehead to the wood and whispered, "They're almost through." When Agnes asked what that meant, Lucy simply smiled and said, "You'll understand when the sky turns black at noon." Agnes no longer knew what terrified her more, her daughter's knowledge or the creeping part of her that wanted to believe it. Dr. Henry Calloway rarely left the Harper house. He kept a cot in the study and filled notebook after notebook with symbols, phrases and phonetic sequences Lucy muttered in her sleep. He claimed he was cataloguing a new form of language, but what disturbed him more was the structure. "These aren't random," he explained one morning to Agnes. "They follow internal logic, syntax, declensions, rules. But no child, no human should be able to build language this fast, not without context, not without exposure." Exposure to what, he didn't say. The patterns had evolved. Lucy no longer scribbled isolated symbols. She wrote columns, paragraphs, entire pages. Her hand moved automatically and she often didn't remember writing anything afterward. But every page followed a form, some form of sacred geometry, encoded into linguistic rhythm. Agnes showed Calloway the drawings from the attic journal, the one belonging to Margaret E. Harper from 1692. His face went white. "These markings, they're nearly identical." Agnes began digging through trunks in the root cellar, pulling out old ledgers, letters, and church records. What she found alarmed her. 3 children in the Harper line had died under unusual circumstances between 1811 and 1863. All 3 were under 10 years old. All 3, according to death notices, had suffered episodes of unnatural behavior, including speaking in strange tongues and drawing repetitive circular symbols. None of this had ever been spoken of. The family Bible made no mention of them. Only the church registries preserved the faint whispers of their existence. Agnes sat alone with this knowledge, her hands shaking, her eyes drawn to the quiet room where her daughter now hummed in tones that didn't belong to this world. "It's in the blood," she whispered. Lucy had become increasingly detached. She rarely responded to her name. She walked from room to room with a far-off gaze, pausing only to trace symbols on the walls or whisper phrases into the fireplace. When Calloway played recordings back, he heard patterns emerge. Not music, not speech, something in between, resonances that repeated, harmonics that spiraled around an inaudible core. One night he brought in a phonograph with a blank cylinder and asked Lucy to speak directly into it. She complied, her voice calm, expression unreadable. Later, when he played it back, a low vibration filled the room, followed by silence. Then his own voice spoke back. But he hadn't recorded anything himself. It recited a date, a place, a warning. He smashed the cylinder and burned the shavings. The pressure inside the village built like a storm trapped beneath glass. The Harpers no longer attended church. Children crossed the street when passing their property. Rumors turned into conviction. Lucy Harper was cursed, or chosen, or both. Reverend Shaw held a private meeting with the town elders. He spoke of thresholds and corruption. He warned that something ancient had taken root again in Bell's Hollow. "It's not the child," he said. "It's what speaks through her." Some nodded, others hesitated, but all agreed on one thing: something had returned. Back at the house, Lucy began writing again, this time on the walls of her room. She used charcoal, soot, and sometimes blood from a cut on her hand. Calloway photographed the markings and spent hours cross-referencing them with text from his archives. Finally, one night, he burst into the parlor holding 3 books. "I found this symbol in a Mesopotamian funerary tablet," he said breathlessly. "And this glyph matches one carved into a Phoenician temple ruin. How is she reproducing extinct iconography with perfect accuracy?" Agnes didn't answer. She was staring at Lucy, who had stopped drawing and was now staring directly at the fireplace. "She says they come from the ash," she whispered. That evening, the family cat disappeared. Then a raven dropped dead at the edge of the porch. Then Nathaniel collapsed at the dining table with a bleeding nose and trembling hands. Lucy watched without expression. Nathaniel recovered the next day, but refused to speak of what he'd seen in his brief blackout. He now wore a crucifix at all times and kept a Bible in every room. He refused to eat meat and would not touch Lucy. "She's unraveling the veil," he muttered once to Agnes. "She's inviting them." Agnes, exhausted and hollowed by weeks of dread, didn't argue. Lucy began automatic writing in sleep, pages filled overnight with words no one could read. When Calloway attempted to decode the structure, he found repetition in number sequences. Then he found star patterns. Then he stopped looking. One sequence repeated across dozens of pages, 3417982.6.66. He called in a colleague to consult. The man looked pale when he examined the numbers. "These are astronomical coordinates," he said, "but they don't match any star chart we've made. It's like they're from the wrong sky." Calloway said nothing. He simply added a lock to Lucy's door. And still the whispers continued. Neighbors claimed to hear voices coming from the fields near the Harper farm at night, chanting, rhythmic and low. Lights appeared in the sky and vanished without sound. A cow was found mutilated, arranged in concentric circles that mirrored Lucy's drawings. Agnes asked Lucy what she was building with her words. "A bridge," she answered. "To where?" Lucy paused. Then she smiled. "To the place we forgot." Calloway wasn't the first to think it. He was simply the first to say it aloud. "This is Salem all over again," he whispered, poring over Lucy's transcriptions. He traced a lineage on parchment, connecting names long buried in church records to Lucy's bloodline. At its root, Sarah Good. Hanged in 1692 for witchcraft, one of the first to die in the infamous trials. A woman whose descendants had long been scrubbed from public memory, but the Harpers were hers, and Lucy, it seemed, had inherited more than just a name. When Agnes read the papers, her hands trembled. It wasn't just shame or fear, it was recognition. Her grandmother used to speak of dreams she wasn't supposed to have, words she wasn't allowed to write. "Something runs in us," she whispered to herself. The village of Bell's Hollow, meanwhile, reached a slow-boiling panic. The town was split. Half saw Lucy as a cursed child, an echo of pagan blood that should have stayed buried. The others saw her as something holy. Not divine exactly, but chosen. She had become a symbol, a mirror onto which they projected all their fear and longing. People came to the Harper's fence at night, some to pray, some to spit. One man left a candle with a note. "She is the fire and the wound." Even the church began to fracture. Reverend Shaw's sermons grew more desperate. "We did not finish the work in 1692, he preached. The serpent lay dormant, but now it coils again. He begged the townspeople to fast, to repent, to resist the temptation of understanding. The devil, he thundered, gives knowledge before he gives pain." Inside the Harper home, Lucy was changing. Her body grew colder by the day. Her hands stayed blue even near the fire. She slept with her eyes half open, lips still moving. One evening, she spoke clearly for the first time in days. "They're listening now," she said, "not just through me, through all of you." Agnes asked who they were. Lucy turned to the window. "You'll call them what you called them before, demons, witches, but they're older than sin." The woman who had once visited Lucy, Miriam Caldwell, returned. She'd stayed away, unnerved by her first visit, but something drew her back. She brought a gift, a cloth-bound book filled with accounts from other children like Lucy, from all corners of the world, cases of glossolalia, prophetic visions, impossible knowledge. One account described a girl in rural Italy who could recite the funerary rites of Babylon, who died with ash in her lungs despite no fire being present. Miriam pointed to the margin. She called them the Grey Choir. Lucy flipped through the pages. She stopped at a drawing of concentric symbols and tapped it twice. "This is what's under your town," she said. That same week, the woman's body was found on the edge of the forest. Her face was twisted in terror. Her hands were blackened, palms scorched. There were no signs of fire. The sheriff said exposure. The coroner said a seizure. But Calloway, looking through her bag, found the book, open to a page Lucy had marked. The ink had bled. Agnes no longer trusted sleep. She sat awake through the nights, rocking silently, afraid to dream. When she did, the dreams were filled with that ancient cathedral again, vast halls with no doors, only windows facing inward. Lucy said nothing of the death. But she stopped eating entirely. Agnes confronted her. "You will eat," she snapped. Lucy only stared at the bowl. Then she whispered, "They never needed food." "Only breath." Agnes smashed the bowl against the wall. "I want my daughter back." Lucy blinked slowly, then stopped looking at me like I'm someone else. The final fracture came. The night lightning struck the chapel steeple. Flames didn't spread, but the cross fell and shattered the pulpit. Some said it was weather, others judgment. Reverend Shaw doubled down. He led processions through the streets, calling for Lucy to be cleansed. He didn't say killed, but he didn't need to. Nathaniel stood guard at the house, shotgun in hand. He'd long abandoned his fire and brimstone prayers. Now he kept vigil like a man preparing for siege. "Let them come," he muttered. "They think they're fighting the devil. They don't know what's coming." One night, Calloway asked Lucy why she kept speaking in dead tongues. She looked at him and said, "Because the living ones lie." Then she paused. "Would you like to hear them sing?" Calloway didn't respond. Lucy smiled and began humming. The melody was haunting, repetitive, impossibly old. That night, Calloway dreamed of towers with no walls and oceans made of ash. He woke screaming. The cross burned on the Harper's lawn just after midnight. It wasn't large, maybe 5 feet tall, but the message was unmistakable. Nathaniel stood at the porch with his shotgun, jaw clenched, watching the flames spit sparks into the dark. He didn't move to extinguish it. He let it burn. Agnes wept, not from fear but exhaustion. She pressed Lucy to her chest, but the child showed no emotion. She only whispered, "Now they've chosen." By morning, the charred remains had collapsed into blackened earth, and the word witch had been carved into the fence with a blade. Reverend Shaw had given up preaching from the pulpit. Now he moved through town like a prophet, speaking on corners and in fields, quoting scripture with eyes alight and voice sharp as fire. "She is the seed of the old tongue," he declared. "She bears the mark of forgotten Babel, and I say to you, cut out the root before it consumes the tree." He gathered a following, devout men and women who had once whispered in fear, but now marched in step. They fasted. They prayed aloud in public. They dipped their hands in holy water and left wet prints on every threshold in town. Some called them the Vigilant, others the Flock. Calloway called them dangerous. "These aren't pilgrims," he told Agnes. "They're a fuse waiting for flame." Nathaniel fortified the house. He boarded the windows, reinforced the doors, and stationed himself on the second floor with a hunting rifle. "I've seen mobs," he said, voice low. "I saw them in France. Same eyes, same fear, different flag." Agnes didn't argue. She simply packed bags, just in case. But Lucy showed no intention of leaving. "They're watching from below," she said one morning. "If I go, they'll come faster." "What do you mean?" Agnes asked. "They want to hatch," Lucy said, and returned to drawing. The tension in Bell's Hollow reached its snapping point when livestock across 3 farms turned up dead, hearts removed, no blood, arranged in circles. The sheriff posted a notice blaming wolves. No one believed it. That night, Shaw's followers gathered near the churchyard. They carried torches. They recited from Revelation. Then they marched 20 strong toward the Harper property. Nathaniel saw them coming from the attic window. He didn't warn Agnes. He simply lit the lantern, loaded his gun, and waited. But the mob didn't storm the door. They stood outside the fence, chanting, "Purge the tongue, bind the mouth, break the seal." Lucy stood at the window, watching them with eyes that shimmered in the lantern light. "They're too late," she said. Calloway tried to intervene. He approached Shaw directly at the general store and begged him to reconsider. "This is hysteria," he said. "You'll burn a child for what you don't understand." "She's not a child," Shaw growled. "She's a conduit. And when the conduit opens, hell follows." "She's sick," Calloway insisted. "No," Shaw snapped. "She's ancient." That night, Agnes did what no one expected. She stood on the porch as the vigilant returned, arms raised, voice calm. "You want her?" she said. "Then hear her." She held out a phonograph, already wound, and placed the needle. From the machine, Lucy's voice poured out, low, strange, melodic. At first it was nonsense, then rhythm. Then the words began to align like threads pulled tight. Half the crowd covered their ears. A woman fell to her knees, weeping. A man screamed and fled into the dark. When the needle reached the end, silence returned. Agnes looked out at the mob. "She's not evil," she said. "She's reminding us." Shaw stepped forward. "Of what?" Agnes stared at him. "That we were never alone." The next morning, Reverend Shaw awoke to blood dripping from his ears. His wife said he had been mumbling in his sleep, words she didn't recognize. He couldn't speak for hours. When he finally did, he recited verses in perfect Sumerian. He didn't know Sumerian. By nightfall, he'd barricaded himself in the chapel, refusing to speak to anyone. On the 3rd day, he emerged pale, trembling, and changed. He told his followers to stop, but they didn't. Agnes made a choice. She walked into town, into the square, and spoke to anyone who would listen. "She's not possessed," she said. "She's a warning, a mirror. She's what this place has tried to bury for centuries." Most turned away. A few nodded. One old man muttered, "So it begins again." At home, Nathaniel confessed something he'd hidden. Years ago, he'd seen something in the woods, just once. A shape, not human, not animal. And Lucy had been a baby in his arms. He'd never spoken of it. "It didn't speak," he said. "But I understood." Agnes asked him what it said. He looked at his daughter. "That she'd remember for all of us." That night, Lucy levitated. Only a few inches, only for seconds. But Agnes saw it. Nathaniel saw it. So did Calloway. No one said a word. Lucy only whispered, "They're listening closer now." The Reverend returned 3 days later, cloaked in silence and scripture. His eyes had changed, no longer burning with zeal, but hollowed by something he'd seen and refused to name. Yet his conviction remained. "She must be cleansed," he said. He arrived at the Harper house with 2 deacons and a leather-bound Bible darkened by years. Calloway objected immediately, demanding scientific consideration, not spiritual assault. "This isn't possession," he argued. It's cognition, evolution, conscious recall of extinct tongues. Shaw raised a hand. Then let us test it. If it is not evil, it will not flee. Nathaniel stood frozen at the door, rifle slack in his hands. Agnes wanted to scream. Lucy sat in her chair, hands folded neatly in her lap. I'll allow it, she said softly. The exorcism began at sundown. Lucy was seated in the parlour, a crucifix placed around her neck, holy water nearby. The Reverend recited Latin prayers, moving clockwise, sprinkling salt and whispering verses under his breath. Lucy remained calm, silent, her eyes on the ceiling. 10 minutes in, she blinked slowly and spoke. Vos estis in templo quod extroximus. The Reverend paused. Who speaks through you? Lucy smiled. There is no through, only with. He pressed harder. Scripture spilled from his mouth, louder now, more urgent. One deacon clutched a rosary until his fingers turned white. The other trembled. Then the room changed. The air grew heavy, thick like fog laced with iron. The temperature dropped. Every candle in the room flickered in unison, a rhythmic pulse that mimicked a heartbeat. Lucy lifted her hands. Then she began to speak. 12 languages, simultaneously. Calloway stared in disbelief. Her voice split, layered, echoed, fractal, one tongue over another, none interrupting, none conflicting. Hebrew, Akkadian, Latin, Phoenician, Chaldean, Egyptian, Aramaic. Dialects forgotten even by scholars. One deacon collapsed, his ears bleeding. The other vomited. Reverend Shaw shouted a final phrase, Exiabea spiritus immunt, and then all sound stopped. Lucy opened her eyes. Her pupils were gone. In their place, soft, flickering light. Too late, she whispered. We're already inside. The Reverend fell back, trembling. A dark liquid trickled from his nose. He crawled toward the door, muttering the Lord's Prayer in fragments. Nathaniel helped him outside. The deacons followed, dazed and silent. Inside, Lucy sat still, face serene, her eyes slowly returning to normal. Agnes wrapped her daughter in a blanket, though she wasn't cold. She looked down at the girl and asked, Why did you let them try? Because they needed to fail, Lucy answered. So they'd stop pretending. Word spread faster than fire. Half the town heard about what happened. Whispers turned to certainty. The vigilant claimed the ritual had failed because Lucy had killed the faith in Bell's Hollow. Others believed it had worked, but revealed something they weren't prepared to see. Shaw disappeared for days. When he returned, he burned every sermon he'd ever written and resigned from the church. He no longer spoke to anyone. That night, Lucy drew a symbol in ash across the floorboards of the house. It matched a shape Calloway had found in a Syrian temple, unearthed only months before. An excavation kept secret by scholars fearing panic. He asked Lucy what it meant. She looked at the shape and said, Arrival. Calloway pressed further. Arrival of what? She didn't answer. Instead, she placed her palm in the center of the circle, closed her eyes and began humming. The tune was low, steady, older than memory. When she opened her eyes again, she said, Boston. Agnes made a decision. She couldn't stay in Bell's Hollow, not after what she'd seen, not after what her daughter had become or what had awakened in her. The town had turned into a crucible of fear, and the heat was no longer survivable. That night she packed a bag for Lucy, then another for herself. Nathaniel didn't protest. He kissed his daughter's forehead and whispered something only she could hear. Then he handed Agnes the car keys. Calloway offered to accompany them. The three of them left before dawn, heading for Boston, away from fields of salt and blood. As the house disappeared in the rearview mirror, Lucy looked back once, just once. Then she said, They won't forget. Back in Bell's Hollow, the barn doors creaked open on their own. The wind carried voices no one recognized, and in the soil where the cross once burned, something began to pulse. Softly, steadily, waiting. Boston was louder than Lucy remembered. The last time she'd been there, she was 4, barely tall enough to see over the seat of the train. Now, at 8, She seemed older than the city itself. Agnes found them a room at a boarding house in Dorchester, modest, clean, far from the eyes of Bell's Hollow. Calloway arranged for her to be seen by specialists, though few dared to document what they observed. Lucy was cooperative, polite, but her presence unsettled everyone. She spoke little in public, yet at night, in her sleep, the old voices returned. Muffled prayers, names in extinct tongues, chants with no known rhythm. Agnes recorded them in a notebook. Not because she understood, but because forgetting them felt like a sin. Harvard welcomed Calloway's reports with skeptical intrigue. He presented transcripts, drawings, audio recordings, though most had corrupted or inexplicably erased. He formed a private circle of linguists, theologians, and mystics, carefully selected scholars, each sworn to secrecy. They met in basements. They argued by candlelight. Lucy was never brought to campus. Calloway called her a living codex. Others called her a risk. "She's rewriting the past," said Dr. Lennox, a Sumerian expert. "Not metaphorically, literally. Her phonemes reshape dead dialects. She's building language from below." "Below what?" someone asked. No one answered. Lucy continued drawing. Not symbols this time. Structures. Stone spires, vaulted chambers, a tall gate flanked by horned figures, always the same cathedral-like ruin, always from a different angle. She called it the Quiet House. One day she added a new image, the skyline of Boston. Behind it, rising from the harbor, was the Quiet House, looming, impossible, eternal. Agnes took the page from her and quietly burned it in the sink. The nightmares grew stronger. Agnes would wake to Lucy standing by the window, staring at nothing. When asked what she saw, she'd reply, "Not yet, but soon." Calloway began dreaming too. "Identical dreams," he confessed. "Always ash in the air, always chanting from beneath the floorboards." He started keeping a dagger beside his bed. He never said why. The team of linguists grew smaller. Some walked away. One was institutionalized after claiming he'd spoken back to Lucy in a trance. Another vanished from his apartment, leaving behind a single note. "The threshold isn't locked anymore." His apartment door had remained dead-bolted from the inside. Lucy's language changed again. Her speech slowed, deepened. She spoke less like a child mimicking tongues and more like a scholar explaining truths no one else remembered. She corrected Calloway's translations with subtle shifts that unlocked entire meanings. Her grammar was recursive, her metaphors endless. "She's tapping into something buried beneath cognition itself," Calloway told Agnes. "She's changing," Agnes whispered. Calloway shook his head. "She's revealing." One afternoon, Lucy was taken for a walk near Jamaica Pond. She paused at the water's edge, stared into the ripples, and said, "This was once the mouth." Agnes knelt beside her. "Of what?" Lucy smiled gently. "Of the thing that sang first." Agnes didn't press further. That night, Lucy drew a mouth made of stone, lined with teeth not meant for eating but for speaking. She labeled it Origin. The scholars grew paranoid. One man swore he saw shadows move without light. Another heard Lucy whispering from behind his wall, though he lived miles away. The group fragmented. Only Calloway remained loyal, or obsessed. He began recording every word Lucy said, even casual ones. He tracked speech patterns, atmospheric pressure, temperature changes. He noticed the air grew colder every time Lucy spoke her unknown language. Not metaphorically, measurably. He tried to present his findings to a private society in Cambridge. They refused him entry. "It's not research anymore," they said. "It's invitation." Lucy spent more time asleep than awake, but her dreams weren't hers alone. Agnes began hearing voices through the walls, her own name in strange inflection, her childhood memories spoken back to her in reversed cadence. She covered the mirrors. She stopped answering the phone. One evening, Lucy sat up in bed and said, "Don't be afraid, Mama. They only want to return." "Return where?" "To the center, where sound began." Agnes burst into tears. "I don't understand." Lucy held her hand and said, You were never meant to. On a stormy Wednesday, Lucy visited the Boston Public Library with Calloway. She stopped in front of a stone lion statue and placed her hand on its paw. She whispered something too soft to hear. The stone vibrated. Calloway felt it. So did two guards. One guard later resigned. That night, the statue cracked. Agnes packed again. I can't do this anymore, she told Calloway. He nodded. She's not a child, Agnes whispered. Not anymore. Calloway looked at Lucy through the doorway. She never was. Calloway had studied ancient cults for over a decade, but nothing prepared him for Lucy's final drawings. They weren't images anymore, they were instructions. Blueprints of a place that didn't exist, not in any documented geography. A structure with corridors that looped into themselves, a chamber with no doors, a central altar formed not of stone, but of written sound, glyphs inscribed into negative space. He called it the inner sanctum. It's not a building, he whispered to Agnes, it's a linguistic construct. She's describing a space you don't enter with your body, only with meaning. Agnes stared at him, her eyes hollow. And where is it? Calloway placed a map of Massachusetts on the table. Lucy had marked a location outside Salem, just beyond the remains of a colonial settlement long forgotten. The coordinates led to a forested ridge no one had walked in decades. Agnes said nothing. Lucy looked at her and said, That's where the listening started. They traveled by train, then wagon. Lucy said very little, her eyes fixed on something only she could see. She held the journal across her lap, the pages filled with diagrams no human architect could have conceived. When they reached the ridge, Calloway led the way, machete in hand. Trees closed around them, dense and ancient. The deeper they walked, the quieter it became. Even birds stopped singing. The forest felt like it had held its breath for centuries. After 2 hours, Lucy stopped. Here, she said. There was no building, no ruins. Only a clearing with moss-covered stones arranged in a wide, deliberate spiral. Agnes felt something shift beneath her ribs. Calloway knelt, brushed leaves aside, and uncovered a flat stone inscribed with the same markings Lucy had been drawing for weeks. They've been here, he whispered. No, Lucy said. They never left. They spent the night in the woods. Lucy didn't sleep. She sat in the center of the spiral, chanting softly. Not in tongues this time, but in a melodic whisper that mirrored the cadence of the wind. Calloway tried to record her, but every device failed. Wires shorted, batteries drained. He began writing by hand, frantic, desperate to keep pace with her words. Listen to the ratios, Lucy said. That's where the meaning hides. He wept. By dawn, something had changed. Agnes awoke to find the spiral glowing faintly beneath the soil, lines of heatless light pulsing in rhythm with Lucy's breath. When she stepped closer, she heard it, a humming, low and resonant like distant choirs buried in rock. Calloway stood barefoot, shirt soaked in sweat, muttering equations. She's opened it, he said. What is it? Agnes asked. He pointed to the center. It's the lexicon. The one that came before the world. Lucy stood, turned to Agnes and said, They carved language into the bones of the earth so it couldn't be unspoken, but now it remembers. That afternoon, they uncovered something deeper. A stone slab cracked underfoot, revealing stairs descending into blackness. The steps were narrow and damp, cut into the earth without tool marks. Moss grew in patterns along the walls, spiraling inward, always inward. At the bottom, they found the chamber. It wasn't large, but it felt endless. A circular room with no corners. Walls covered in carvings, hundreds, maybe thousands, of languages overlapping one another. Some modern, some dead, some not human. In the center stood a pedestal of bone-white stone, etched with glyphs that shimmered in the dim light. Lucy approached it without fear. She placed her hand on the surface and whispered, Anchor. The chamber trembled. Calloway collapsed. Agnes screamed. The tremor passed, but something lingered. The air tasted metallic. Time slowed. Sound flattened. Even their own voices began to echo in ways that didn't make sense, responses arriving before words were spoken, syllables folding in on themselves. Lucy turned to them and said, "This is where I began." "You were born in Bell's Hollow," Agnes said, voice trembling. Lucy shook her head. "No. That's where I arrived. This is where I began." Calloway scribbled furiously, his hands shaking. "This chamber is pre-linguistic. It's the origin field, the space where symbols acquire meaning before the mouth ever speaks them." Agnes didn't answer. She watched as Lucy sat at the pedestal and began humming again, same song, same rhythm, and the glyphs on the wall began to move. Symbols twisted, not physically but perceptually. They rearranged themselves in Agnes's mind. She blinked and saw her mother's face in one glyph, her father's voice in another. Memory, language, emotion, all merged into shape. Agnes dropped to her knees, crying. "Why me?" she whispered. Lucy turned. "Because you listened." They returned to the surface before nightfall. No words were exchanged. The spiral had gone dark. The forest remained still. Lucy clutched the journal to her chest. Calloway, pale and silent, walked like a man carrying a secret too heavy for the world. Agnes knew deep down nothing would ever be the same. Something had awakened, not just beneath the earth, but inside them, and it remembered everything. Agnes didn't speak for the entire train ride back to Boston. She stared through the window, watching the trees blur past, their branches tangled like questions without answers. Lucy sat beside her, quiet, expression unreadable. Calloway, across the aisle, gripped a leather notebook so tightly his knuckles turned white. No one asked what they had seen. There were no words that would have fit. But something had changed. Back in the boarding house, Agnes woke screaming. The dream had felt real, cold earth underfoot, a great mouth opening in the sky, voices crawling inside her ears like water. She clutched her rosary for the first time in years, fingers trembling as she tried to pray. But the words wouldn't come. When she finally managed to whisper "Our Father," the syllables felt foreign in her mouth, empty of warmth, hollow as dust. She dropped the rosary on the floor and stared at her hands. They didn't feel like hers anymore. Calloway isolated himself in his study. He tried to recreate the diagrams from the chamber, but the angles refused to align. Straight lines curved. Circles fractured into ellipses that defied geometry. He scrawled page after page, convinced he was close to something, but each revelation bled into dread. He stopped eating. He stopped shaving. On the fifth night, he burst into Agnes's room, eyes wild. "I think it's not a place," he said. "It's a memory. We didn't find it. We returned to it." Agnes said nothing. Lucy from her bed replied, "It remembers you too." Whispers spread through the boarding house. Other guests complained of sounds at night, chanting like old prayers through the walls. One woman fled in the middle of the night, claiming she'd seen a child standing on the ceiling of the stairwell, whispering backward. The landlady began crossing herself every time she passed Lucy. And yet Lucy never left the room. She only wrote and hummed. Agnes watched her daughter and wondered how far gone she was. Not Lucy, but herself. She no longer recognized her own thoughts. She would reach for the Bible and feel nothing. Words that once gave comfort now felt brittle and strange. She stopped attending church altogether. The priest came once, offering communion. Agnes shut the door in his face. She spent long hours staring at the mirror, as if waiting for her reflection to blink first. Calloway tried to warn the university. He mailed packages filled with notes, diagrams, explanations. Most were returned unopened. A few responded with silence. One professor called in the middle of the night, his voice shaking. "You don't understand what you found," he whispered. "That chamber wasn't a sanctuary, it was a vault." Then he hung up. The next morning, Calloway received a telegram. "Professor Langford found dead. No signs of struggle. Notes incinerated. Proceed no further." He ignored it. Lucy no longer asked permission to speak in her unknown tongue. She let it flow freely. Agnes found herself listening, then repeating. At first, only small phrases, then full sentences. She didn't understand what they meant, but the cadence felt right, like sliding into the right key after years of dissonance. One night she woke and found herself standing over Lucy's bed, whispering to her daughter in perfect alignment, voice layered beneath Lucy's own. They didn't open their eyes. They just sang. Calloway began losing time. He would blink and hours would vanish. His journals rearranged themselves. He wrote things he didn't remember, names, coordinates, warnings. One line repeated itself across 4 pages. The words are teeth. Stop chewing. He blacked out during a lecture. When he woke, his students were gone. The chalkboard read, "She is the breath of forgotten speech." He never returned to campus. The decision to leave Boston wasn't made. It was felt. Agnes began packing again, not from fear, but instinct. Lucy said nothing, only nodded. "We're being called," she said. "To where?" Agnes asked. Lucy touched her chest. "Where the center waits." Calloway didn't argue. He simply packed his journals, locked the door and followed. They returned to Bell's Hollow under a sky that had turned the wrong color, grey-green, like bruised flesh. The fields stood silent. The chapel steeple had collapsed. The town looked the same but smelled of iron. The Harper house remained intact, but the barn doors were missing. Agnes stepped into the parlor and dropped to her knees. The walls were covered in writing, Lucy's symbols etched in soot, ash and blood. "I didn't do this," Lucy said. "They did." Nathaniel was waiting inside. He looked older, hollowed, but his eyes were clear. "I knew you'd return," he said. Agnes ran to him. They held each other in silence. He turned to Lucy. "You brought them home." Lucy smiled. "No. I brought us back." The wind didn't move in Bell's Hollow anymore. It pulsed. The trees stood unnaturally still. Animals had vanished. Even the crows, once constant shadows on fence posts, had gone silent. But the ground, it murmured, low, rhythmic, like breathing. Lucy sat cross-legged on the floor of the Harper home, her eyes closed. She hadn't eaten in days. Her skin was pale, almost translucent. But her voice, soft, slow, continuous, never ceased. She whispered in cycles, in spirals, in patterns that made Calloway tremble without knowing why. Agnes swept dust from the cellar steps. Nathaniel brought down lanterns. Something had been calling them since they returned, and now they knew where to look. It began with a draft. Nathaniel noticed it first, a breeze where none should be, a chill rising from the cellar floor. Beneath the flagstones they found a hollow sound. Calloway fetched tools. They pried up the stones one by one until they uncovered the opening. A square of darkness cut into the foundation, far older than the house itself. Lucy smiled when she saw it. They left the door open. They descended slowly. The tunnel beneath the house was narrow at first, then widened into a corridor carved from black stone. The walls were damp and rough, but marked, faint etchings glowing with a dull, sickly light, symbols they had seen before, on Lucy's pages, on the bones in the forest, in dreams. None of them spoke. Further down, the tunnel split into a circular chamber. Its center collapsed into a pit. The walls were covered in bones, hundreds, possibly thousands, arranged with intention, children, adults, all with the same carved marks across the skulls. Calloway dropped to his knees, overcome. "This isn't a burial site," he whispered. "It's an archive." Agnes felt the weight in her chest grow unbearable. "Whose bones are these?" Lucy answered without looking. "Ours." In the pit center lay a stone slab, cracked and stained. Above it, faint chanting echoed, not from any direction, but from within the walls themselves. Agnes stepped forward, heart hammering, when her foot struck something buried in the dirt, a pendant, iron, blackened with age. The same one she'd seen in Margaret Harper's journal. She reached for it with shaking hands. Lucy touched her wrist. "Don't." "Why?" "It remembers being worn." They moved deeper. The far side of the chamber led to a narrow passage that sloped downward. The air grew warmer, thicker. The smell of ash and wet stone filled their lungs. Eventually they reached the sanctum, a dome-shaped room larger than the house above. Its ceiling rose higher than possible, impossible for the space they had crossed. In the center, etched into the floor, was a spiral of symbols, identical to the one Lucy had drawn since the beginning. This was the origin. Calloway stepped forward, tears in his eyes. This place predates language. It's where meaning began. Nathaniel said nothing. He stared at the walls, his lips moving without sound. Agnes approached the spiral, her hands trembling. Then Lucy walked calmly into the center and sat. They've been waiting. The room responded. The spiral began to glow, symbols shimmered to life, pulsing in synchrony with Lucy's breath. The air vibrated, not with sound, but intent. Agnes staggered back. Nathaniel clutched his chest. Calloway dropped his notebook and fell to his knees. Lucy began to speak, not in tongues, not in human language, but in concepts. The room trembled. Each word she released carried weight, like a stone dropped into water, rippling across thought itself. They felt memories not their own, lives never lived, deaths never mourned, songs never sung. It was overwhelming. It was divine. It was monstrous. Then the spiral flared. A sudden rush of pressure filled the sanctum, then silence. Lucy collapsed backward. Agnes rushed to her. She was still breathing but unconscious, cold. Calloway, still dazed, muttered, "It wasn't just a ritual. It was a transmission." Nathaniel stared at the ceiling, eyes wide. "They've opened the veil." They carried Lucy back up the tunnel, each step heavier than the last. The house above felt too small now, too shallow. The sky outside looked wrong, clouds unmoving, the sun dimmer than it should have been. Lucy remained asleep for hours. When she woke, she whispered only one word: "Soon." That night, Calloway sat alone in the parlor, reviewing his notes. He didn't notice the shadow that moved without light. He didn't see the writing slowly etching itself into the walls, but he heard her voice, calm, certain, echoing from beneath the floorboards. And for the first time, he understood every word. The morning Lucy woke, the wind stopped. Not slowed, stopped. Leaves hung motionless. Curtains drooped lifelessly. Not a single branch swayed. The air felt wrong, thick with potential, as if the sky were holding its breath. Agnes felt it first, a pressure behind her eyes, a hum just below hearing. She looked at Lucy, who stood barefoot in the kitchen, staring at the wall as though it were a window. "They're here," Lucy said. No panic, no urgency, just the calm certainty of someone greeting old friends. Down in the sanctum, the spiral had begun to pulse again, without her. Calloway watched from the edge of the chamber, notebook forgotten in his lap, too shaken to write. The glyphs moved now, shifting slowly across the stone like molasses stirred by time. He whispered into the dark, "They're waking it up." Or maybe they were being awakened by it. He didn't know which terrified him more. Nathaniel, silent for hours, now roamed the house reciting psalms from memory, not out loud but under his breath, as if afraid the words might betray him. Agnes tried to reason with him. "They're not devils," she said. "She's not cursed." Nathaniel shook his head. "You haven't seen what I've seen." "What did you see?" He didn't answer, but he carried the iron pendant in his fist like a weapon. Lucy walked into the parlor around noon and stood in the center of the rug. "They're inside me now," she said. Agnes blinked. "What do you mean?" "I don't hear them anymore. I am them." Agnes felt her heart freeze. Calloway entered from the hallway, pale and wide-eyed. "Lucy, what's changed?" She turned to him slowly. "Nothing. You're just finally able to feel it." And then the light bulbs popped one by one in rapid succession. The room plunged into grey, lit only by the shimmer beneath the floor. Later that afternoon, Nathaniel approached Calloway. He held out the pendant. "You said it was a relic," he muttered. "Sumerian or older?" Calloway nodded. "Or older?" Nathaniel stared at it. "Can it stop her?" Calloway hesitated. "It can sever the link." Nathaniel's voice turned gravel. "And what happens to her?" Calloway didn't answer. Nathaniel pocketed the pendant and walked away. The following night, Agnes found Lucy in the hallway, whispering not to herself but into the walls. "Who are you talking to?" she asked. Lucy looked up with glowing eyes, faint pale gold, barely visible, and said, "The ones beneath the veil, the ones who never forgot the first word." "What do they want?" Lucy's smile widened slowly. "To be remembered." At midnight, the earth trembled. Just once. The house shifted on its foundation. Dishes clattered, cracks spider-webbed along the windows. From beneath the floorboards came a deep rhythmic sound, like breathing or the turning of a massive gear. Calloway ran outside. No storm, no wind, no tremor beyond the property line. Something was waking, but only here, only where Lucy was. In the sanctum, the spiral no longer glowed. It roared. Light pulsed from the symbols with each step Lucy took. The walls hummed. The dome resonated like a bell struck by an invisible hammer. Agnes tried to stop her. "Please," she begged, "just tell me what's happening." Lucy turned and placed a hand on her mother's cheek. "This is the part where we stop pretending it's not already inside everything." Upstairs, Nathaniel waited by the hearth, the pendant in one hand, the family Bible in the other. When Lucy entered, he didn't speak. He simply stood and said, "I'm sorry." Then he lunged. Agnes screamed. Calloway ran forward, but before Nathaniel could press the pendant to her skin, Lucy raised her hand. With a word, one word, he stopped moving. Frozen, suspended mid-step, mid-breath, his eyes wide, terrified. Lucy leaned in and whispered into his ear. Then she stepped back. Nathaniel collapsed like a puppet with strings cut, unconscious, breathing, but gone in some deeper way. Calloway dragged him to the couch, checked his pulse. Agnes held her daughter, shaking. "What did you do?" Lucy answered softly. "I reminded him." "Of what?" "What it cost last time." Later, Calloway walked alone in the woods, unable to sleep, unable to think. He watched the moon shift colors. He listened to whispers in branches that didn't move, and then in the stillness, a voice not his own echoed in his skull. "You opened the mouth. Now speak." He turned, but no one was there, only silence, and the sound of something breathing below his feet. The chant began just before dawn, soft at first, barely audible beneath the floorboards. Then louder, swelling with rhythm, not like singing but something older. The sound pulsed like a heartbeat. It didn't echo. It inhabited the walls. Lucy stood in the center of the living room, eyes closed, arms raised. The language she spoke was no longer a stream of foreign syllables. It was structure, intention, a bridge built word by word toward something waiting in the dark. Calloway listened with tears in his eyes. "It's not invocation," he whispered. "It's alignment. She's syncing reality with memory." Agnes clutched the doorframe, breath shallow. "With whose memory?" Lucy opened her eyes. "Ours." Outside, birds dropped from the sky mid-flight. Animals fled the woods. Some ran into fences. Others simply collapsed. Electricity flickered across the county, devices failing one by one. Radios sputtered and died. Clocks reversed. Glasses cracked. The air felt heavy with static, but no storm came. Just the chant. Always the chant. Nathaniel never woke. He lay unmoving, eyes shut, heart steady, but his consciousness had been placed elsewhere, tucked into the folds of something larger than thought. Lucy had returned something to him, or taken something away. Agnes stayed beside him, whispering psalms through clenched teeth, her voice hollow. She looked to Calloway. "Make her stop." He didn't answer. He couldn't. In the sanctum below, the spiral opened. Not physically, but perceptually. The glyphs rearranged themselves into patterns that no eye could trace. Anyone who stared too long began to see things behind the walls. Silhouettes, glimpses of places with no light and no sound. A vibration spread through the soil, rising like heat from the pit. And then, a voice. Not Lucy's, not Calloway's. Something else. It didn't speak through air. It bypassed the senses and pressed directly into thought. "You have remembered." The government arrived by noon. 3 men in black coats arriving unannounced, unmarked. One carried a case, another held a brief. They didn't ask permission. They showed no credentials. They walked the perimeter of the property and said only, "We've been tracking the frequency." They entered the house, listened for 30 seconds, then descended into the cellar. They didn't come back up. An hour later, the front door closed. Only one man remained. He approached Agnes with a calm, hollow voice. "You need to evacuate." Agnes shook her head. "She's still my daughter." The man didn't argue. He opened a journal, his own, and showed her something she shouldn't have seen. A drawing, a transcription, the exact spiral Lucy had created. Only dated 1871. "Someone else found it," he said. "They didn't live long enough to finish the chant." Agnes's hands trembled. "What happens when it's finished?" The man looked toward the house. "We don't know." Then he walked into the forest and vanished. Lucy continued chanting. No pauses, no breath. Her body seemed to hover just slightly, as though weight had forgotten her. Calloway, now a shell of his former self, scribbled across every page he could find, trying to trace the phonetic pattern. "It's language without boundary," he muttered. "It loops into itself. No subject, no object, just function, just opening." Agnes slapped the notebook from his hands. "She's a child." Calloway didn't flinch. "She's not." That night, the stars disappeared, not behind clouds. They simply vanished, wiped clean from the sky, leaving only black. And in that black something moved. Slow, massive, unknowable. Agnes watched from the porch, her arms wrapped around her own body. She whispered Lucy's name again and again, but it no longer had power. It was just a name. And Lucy had become more than that. In the sanctum, glyphs burned into the stone without flame. The spiral collapsed inward, forming a shape not meant for perception, a word made of sound and silence, concept and flesh. Lucy walked into it. Calloway tried to follow. Agnes screamed for him to stop, but it was too late. He stepped forward and vanished. No flash, no scream, no mark left behind, only silence. Then the spiral closed, and Lucy was gone. For days, nothing moved. Then, without warning, the chant returned, this time from everywhere, from drains, from trees, from brick, from birds, from people. A new infection, not of the body, but of language. Children began writing in their sleep. Adults spoke phrases they didn't understand. Librarians found entire sections rewritten in symbols no one had catalogued. And those who listened too long began humming the chant themselves. The government sealed the Harper land, declared it a hazardous zone, no press coverage, no official documents. But a man with pale eyes and a sealed briefcase still stands at the gate, watching the windless trees, listening for the next verse. Some say the chant never ended. They say it still echoes, if you know how to hear it. They say it waits inside forgotten ruins, locked phonographs, the pauses between syllables, waiting for someone else to speak the next line, waiting for us to remember. Years passed. The Harper house rotted in silence, vines crawling over the collapsed porch, windows long shattered, doors swollen shut with time. But the spiral beneath remained untouched. No excavation crew dared touch the stone. No one questioned why government lines diverted around the property. Some truths resist paperwork. Locals told stories. Children dared each other to walk near the fence. Some said they heard singing at night. Others said they dreamed of Lucy without ever having met her. No one knew what she had become, but everyone remembered her name. Agnes never left Bell's Hollow. She bought a cabin just outside town, kept to herself. The church never reopened. The chapel's bell tower collapsed in a storm a year later. People said it was a blessing. Agnes grew older but never lost the sharpness in her eyes. She spoke little. She didn't mention the sanctum. She never uttered the chant. But some nights, she stared at the stars and whispered things that didn't match any known tongue, things that made the wind pause. Nathaniel never recovered. He walked with a cane, a scar behind his left ear. where blood vessels had ruptured during the attempted severance, but he spoke again, slowly, deliberately. Not about the past, never about Lucy. He just tended the soil. Planted flowers in spirals, hummed unfamiliar melodies as he worked. Calloway's notebooks were found years later in a safety deposit box registered under a false name. Most of the pages were indecipherable, symbols written in mirrored spirals, others in inverted syntax. Linguists dismissed them as gibberish. But one note stood out, translated in perfect Latin: "The language that forgets itself becomes the key." It was signed with Lucy's name. In 2018, a graduate student at Brown University uncovered a phonograph cylinder mislabeled in the archives. It contained exactly 47 seconds of humming. No instruments, no voice, just tone, layered and shifting. The recording was uploaded online. It went viral in obscure corners of the internet: mystics, linguists, conspiracy theorists. The audio triggered strange phenomena: users reporting lucid dreams, writing in unknown glyphs, hearing whispers when they turned off their lights. The file was deleted 3 days later, but it was too late. A linguist in Norway began reciting a chant in his sleep. A child in Tunisia carved spirals into her bedroom wall with her fingernails. A prisoner in rural Montana drew a perfect replica of the Harper sanctum in chalk across his cell. They had never met, but they spoke in rhythm. They spoke in memory. In 2025, a restricted audio log leaked from a private foundation monitoring linguistic anomalies. The voice was unmistakable: young, calm, familiar. Lucy Harper. She recited a passage that, when run through software, translated to this: "When language remembers its shape, the mouth will return, and with it, the breath between stars." Then silence. Agnes died in her sleep a year later. No illness, no sign of distress. Just a note placed beside her bed, scrawled in her own hand: "She was always love." We were simply too loud to hear it. The town held no funeral, no service, but the night after her passing, every window in Bell's Hollow fogged with breath, though no one had been inside to cause it, and on each pane, someone or something had traced a spiral. Lucy Harper had become legend, a whispered name, a cipher, not a warning, not a threat, but a reminder that there are voices older than history, that language is not ours to control, that sometimes a child doesn't just speak in tongues, she remembers them. In the final recording attributed to her, buried in a hard drive labeled Vocal Layer 37, Lucy speaks just 4 words in clear English: "You will remember me." Then the file corrupts itself. If you listened this far, you've followed a trail most fear to tread, a trail not just into history, but beneath it. If this story moved you, disturbed you, made you wonder, subscribe to our channel for more tales that reveal what lurks beneath the known. And don't stop here. Click the next video on your screen to uncover another forgotten chapter buried in the folds of time. There's always another voice waiting to be heard, always another word waiting to be remembered.